my whole thing, y'all, is that, we can recover completely, and I know people don't like that, but we can, and it can be something that doesn't rule our lives. And I also think that you can get to a place to where it's an established thing for you, and you don't need to do A, B, C, D, or else you're going to relapse. That's a whole nother thing I like to tell people. That's another form of it that feels like a life sentence for me. I do meditation, I do affirmations, I do all those things. But guess what? When I don't do that, am I at risk of relapsing? No, I'm not at all.
Welcome to PodTox. This is episode 7. We are here with AccountaBro, and we're going to learn a little bit about his life, his addiction, get some of his thoughts on harm reduction, and just the opioid epidemic and everything that's going on. So we'll go ahead and get started off with, first off, we just want to hear about your childhood, man. Like what led up to everything that you have gone through?
So my real name is Macaulay, like Macaulay Culkin, which a lot of younger people don't know who that is now. It's really funny. And then my last name is Sexton, so if people want to know my actual name. So yeah, I grew up in Austin, Texas, the live music capital of the world. I grew up with my dad and my uncle being a huge part of the Austin music scene. So I grew up in a very eclectic culture, if you will. On my dad's side, it was like, rock and roll, folk, and blues. And then on my mom's side, it was, hippies. Like my grandma was from San Francisco and moved to Austin in the mid to late 60s and kind of established the counterculture here in Austin. But yeah, I mean, really, I like to tell, like, even the idea of like life stories in recovery. I think, after doing this for a long time, I like to kind of change it up a little bit, honestly. Like I'll go into specific things that are very relevant, but I like to keep it kind of clear and concise, honestly. I think it's something that I learned how to tell my life story while in treatment, and a lot of it was just kind of emulating what other people were doing, like the context of it, and kind of sensationalizing it, not lying or anything, but just presenting it as this such intense thing. And I personally don't really like to do that. I will go into like the good stuff, of course, but I just wanted to be clear on that. That's something for me that has changed over the years to where I really just like to focus on like what really was going on, like what was really going on, not necessarily go into all just kind of wild stories, but I'm open to doing that as well. So basically, what ended up happening is I was a sensitive kid. That's really what it all comes down to. I was a human in a dehumanizing world. That's really a good way to put it. And I learned very quickly that having emotions was labeled as a liability and not an asset. And that was a hard one for me to understand. I really, like I said, grew up in a very eclectic culture with a very alternative family. So emotions were welcomed, and talking about your feelings were welcomed. It was more like kind of the toxic positivity type vibe to where it's like anything I could offer that was negative, it was like, well, just think about it this way or whatever. And for me, that wasn't helpful. A lot of realizing that my elders did not know what they were doing. And that makes you feel very unsafe as a kid, realizing that their emotions could change at the drop of a hat. That's also really it's very discouraging as a child. So a lot of it, like I said, it all comes down to my belief is that individuals can be traumatized by just life in general. It doesn't need to be these adverse events of trauma. Those are also obviously super traumatizing when it's like a real event, like SA or another form like that. And that's part of my story as well. But for the most part, it all started with me just realizing that I just didn't feel safe. I didn't feel safe. My mom is in recovery from alcohol use disorder for 14 years. Throughout my childhood, she was actively drinking. My dad was drinking a lot back then as well. I can't really diagnose him. He doesn't self-identify as an alcoholic or someone with alcohol use disorder, but it was something that, just made me feel very unsafe being in cars with people who were driving drunk and, a bunch of stuff like that. And then I had like my grandma who was a stoner, and that was just like more of my safe space that I would go to and kind of chill with her. But that's really where like the turmoil started for me. And to be honest, at a very young age, basically just through very small things at school that were disciplinary, that were nothing significant, I started to realize that kind of the authority figures in my life didn't really understand what was going on, and that made me not want to be alive, actually. So that was as a young preteen. I suffered with ideation at that age. So that's really where it all started as far as the mental health stuff.
It's an area where music heavy, you've got a lot of people who are trying to make it in life, and I doubt a lot of the kids that were around you were experiencing anything like that, even though I'm sure there were some. But no one else could kind of, I guess, see things from your side. So I'm sure that was super, super hard.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was lucky because my best friend also has a dad who's established as like a legend in the Austin music scene and just throughout like kind of 80s music. And so, but everyone, literally it was to where when I'm looking at my peers, I'm just like, this is totally different. Like y'all know, if you've seen me talk about it, like I was, in bars, playing pool as a preteen and like doing card tricks and trying to like hustle money and stuff and drinking a bunch of Shirley Temples and really funny stuff like that. But it turned me into I was already an old soul since I was, born, but it really sped that up even more to where, I'm at parties and I'm lighting cigarettes for people and stuff. And like, you know what I mean? It was definitely, I was treated like a peer and like a friend. And I established, like with my grandma, I established a friendship more than like a elder type relationship, more than like a grandmother relationship. It would be, we would be sharing bags of flour and or cannabis and stuff like that. So I got to have like a real unique experience. And I'm like, now it's all changed. I used to like demonize all of that and blame all of that. And now I'm like, dude, that's like, I got a really unique experience, basically, like
you embrace it now, correct?
Yeah, no, it was a lot of work and just not demonizing, first of all, substance use and alcohol use. And then that was what I did in an attempt to kind of protect myself when I was, in the first, I don't know, maybe 4 years of recovery. It was like, I got to somehow frame this to where it's bad, so then I won't do it. You know what I mean? And so it was a lot of that. It was a lot of just kind of demonizing everything. And, I demonized, my grandma because she was like, she was smoking with me at a really young age and all this other stuff. And in reality, it reduced a lot of harm in my life because I could be my true self. And I had a space to go to where I could actively reduce harm by just consuming canna. And there was many times to where that was where I would go to, like, after a long binge, I would go out there and, chill with them. But
so when did your car accident come into play? Like, how old were you when that happened?
I was almost 14.
Wow.
And, basically I was really into riding bikes at that time, and luckily I was not riding a fixed gear bike, which I was really into bikes like that. And for those that are unfamiliar, fixed gear the pedals don't stop turning. Like they turn the whole time. And so during that time I was riding a lot of those, and very luckily on this occasion I wasn't, because it's a lot worse if you were to get hit by a car with one of those, because your feet are strapped in and it just, like I said, the pedals keep turning. So you have to lock your legs to even brake on there. Generally speaking, there's not brakes on those bikes. Basically it was just another day of riding a bike. I grew up in not just the, kind of like rock and roll, folk and blues music culture, but I also grew up in actual like old school hip hop culture as well. And I did break dancing, and it was just really funny now. It's just hilarious. I was really into like pretty much all the elements of hip hop, and that does involve break dancing. That does involve graffiti. So I was really into graffiti at the time, and so I was always just kind of going around and riding bikes everywhere. So that was what was going on that night. And yeah, I basically was just going down a hill really fast, and I had a green light, so I was like, I'm good. I'm gonna just breeze through this green light. But someone made an unprotected turn right in front of me, and so I ended up T-boning a car, basically. So I hit a car, and I flew over it. Having a near-death experience is very traumatic, so that's really a huge one for me. The other one I'll say really briefly is that my dad had a stroke on just random occasion, of course, it's always random. And that was the other thing. There was the two really big events that just kind of changed I went deeper, because I said as a little kid I already was like having ideations, and then these things happened and I was like nah, like this is way too much. I don't want to have to deal with this at all.
Did you ever act on any of those ideations? I mean, since you were thinking about it, was there any time where it got super serious?
It did get super serious. I somehow did not act on it. It just went so introspective. It was all this mental punishment. I saw myself as a terrible person, and it was not. I didn't do anything. It was literally like I had overwhelming conscience is what it is. Just a really overwhelming conscience. And I also, this is something that I don't really talk about, but I had this overwhelming presence of the universe. Basically, it felt like the universe was judging me and telling me that I was wrong. And it felt like something that was being imposed upon me from something. It literally felt like it was coming, like being broadcasted from above into my head, that I was bad and that I didn't deserve to be alive. So, and that a lot of that has to do with programming and just this idea of if there is something greater, then it has to be rooted in authority and judgment, you know? So a lot of it was misguided, and it's actually something that's a huge asset to me now. But yeah, I'm a very spiritual person. I just don't like talking about spirituality in the context of recovery because I feel like it's weaponized, and I don't agree with that. I think people can be completely non-spiritual. I think people can not have a higher power at all, actually, and be very successful if they're taking action and doing specific disciplines. So I don't lead with that, but to be honest, that's what it was. I had like an overwhelming spiritual presence and a huge conscience. So luckily I didn't act on anything. But so yeah, it was just those two events. My dad had a stroke, came home and couldn't talk, and was telling me it was time to go to school at like 9 p.m. at night. And then he basically ended up revealing that he was having an affair that night while actively after having a stroke. And so it was, everything just crumbled at that moment, and my parents separated the same night that my dad had a stroke. So it was just one of those things to where as a child, everything that had been established all of a sudden in one night was gone, you know? And so later on is when the getting hit by a car thing happened. And again, that was just like the lower point basically. And so I just progressively would just get to lower points. And yeah, basically I ended up, when I got hit by the car, I totally remember being in the air and thinking, damn, this is a stupid way to die. I was pissed that was how I was, you know, passing away in my mind. And yeah, I ended up basically doing like a front flip and covering my head. And I, you know, landed back, like really slammed down on my back and fractured my L5. I also kind of did a thing and fractured my shoulder blade as well.
So how did your diagnosis affect your mental health and substance use? Is that when you really started to get into liking the feeling of certain pain medication?
So it's not, I don't like this whole narrative that you use a substance, then all of a sudden you flip a switch and you're a so-called addict, or that you have a substance use disorder. Some people identify with that. I think it's kind of, quite frankly, it's parroted all the time, so people kind of just perpetuate that, and I don't think it's always the case. So the diagnosis was significant because it felt like a life sentence to me. I was like, because they're like, you're just gonna have chronic pain for the rest of your life, basically. And if it gets bad, then basically you can get to a point to where you're immobile and disabled, basically. So, you know, and I'm a kid that's skateboarding and riding bikes and doing all this stuff. So I was just like, oh, wow. You know, and it basically, at first I was just taking my meds as prescribed. But it was the first time that I took opioids and benzos at the same time because they gave me Valium.
Yes.
So that was the difference. Because in the past, I had surgeries and I was fine. There was nothing that was inflamed at all. You know what I mean? And something that I want to clarify is all of my use prior to that was not problematic whatsoever. It was all less than anyone that I was hanging out with. I was one of those kids that was like, I'm not going to be like my parents. And so I was like obsessive about, you know, moderation. And I successfully moderated all the time. It was the way I consumed things. And so it's interesting. I think it's important to note that because there's a lot of kids that have parents and they're like, it's never going to be me. It's never going to be me. And then there's things that can happen that are out of your control. And that's where it gets kind of tricky, you know, but yeah, that's where it declined. And I was in bed rest for like 4 months. And I just discovered during that time, it took me about at least 4 to 6 months to even realize that I could take more or add in some like cannabis to the mix, and because that was just readily accessible. And so, yeah, it was basically just me just kind of feeling it out and being like, well, what can I do? Because it was so depressing to be this young kid that now is like basically bedridden, you know?
Did they want you to try to go the more natural route? Did they want you to do like chiropractic, physical therapy? Because years ago when I was in an accident, it was like a whole big, you have to see the pain management doctor, it was like a whole big circle.
Yeah, so I did physical therapy, I did chiropractic work. The chiropractor that I even, we got like a crappy lawyer and tried to get money out of it. I ended up literally, no joke, getting probably about 1K from this, and so it was like nothing at all. It was because there was a lot of hospital bills, and so all that money basically went to that. But yeah, so I did physical therapy. That was helpful. The chiropractor that I went to was the one I had to go to based on, I don't even know why at that point, but it was not a good chiropractor. I do have people hate on chiropractic, and I understand a lot of them are like snake oily, but I have like a legit chiropractor that is very alternative and very like just very different. And it's the only thing that gets me out of a chronic pain flare up, like legit. It's like that's where I go instead of the emergency room.
Did those negative thoughts, did they stay as strong? Like, you're young, you're having these thoughts and everything. Did they grow as you started to grow, or did they kind of lessen and then this happened, so it opened that can of worms all over again?
That's a really good question, because no, that's just where I found disassociation. That's where I discovered the art of disassociation, and just totally, it was an involuntary thing. I always have suffered from disassociation and derealization. I've always felt like a spirit in a body instead of like a body. It's just how I see the world to this day. It's at this point, I'm at peace with it. I'm disassociated every single day. Basically, when I look at my arms or my hands, it's like, oh yeah, I'm in a body, I guess. But you know what I mean? It's very trippy, esoteric, spiritual. But the point being is that's where the disassociation and the derealization got so deep to where it was like, I felt such a relief and kind of getting in the passenger seat, if you will, and just being like, I'm just gonna like let this like ride out. And at the same time, I knew that it was problematic as soon as I started consuming an amount that was not sustainable, and I was articulating it too. I was like telling my grandma specifically. I was like, "Hey, this isn't good," and I already know it's not good. And so there was no stage of me not understanding that it was problematic. It was so normal to me that I felt like it was something I had to do. And that's why I like to tell people is like, it's important to understand the compulsive nature of this. It's, you have a choice in the matter, but there's a lot of constraints, and there's a lot of things that are involved, with that. And so, basically, those things subsided significantly, and that's why it was so effective, and I always like to say, I felt good, and it worked really well.
Do you feel like now you can mentally handle your pain better than when you first got on like the pain meds? Because I went through a transition like that where mentally I was like, oh, I'm going to have to take this the rest of my life. And I accepted that. But now looking back, I could deal with my pain now in different ways. Like you said, chiropractic, physical therapy, different things that help, exercise and moving around.
Yeah, no, my chronic pain is totally manageable, and I hate saying my chronic pain. I encourage people to be careful with things like that. It's something that I was so obsessed with that I always led with my chronic pain. I was just always talking about it, and it's I'm not policing anyone. It's valid to acknowledge things, but for me it became an obsession. I was just obsessed with it, so it made it worse. Basically, is what it did. It made me a little bit more sensitive to pain, actually, and instead of it kind of subsiding, it just kind of it perpetuated it to a certain degree. And so I have flare-ups now, and I am incapacitated though. I cannot stand up. I cannot breathe deeply. I have spasms when I try to breathe in, and that gets scary, because then it's like, I don't want to pass out, stuff like that. And it happens due to very small things. Like I'm getting older, I guess, because I'll like turn and wrong, and then I'm just like, oh, it's not
So
fun.
where did your mindset started to shift? Like, how did you start to deprogram yourself?
I went through a totally traditional path. You know what I mean? I had an intervention. I went to treatment for 4 months, and I did 6 months of sober living. I did 6 months of IOP at the same time. All my meds were prescribed from an addiction medicine specialist or doctor. And so, you know, I was kind of like the poster boy for like traditional treatment and recovery. As far as when I got out of treatment and was in sober living, you know, I immediately went to 12-step meetings, and that's what I did. And I did that because that's the only thing I was offered, and I didn't know there was any other option. So I was like, "This is what you got to do." And there's some valid stuff to having structure like that, and maybe not having as many options. Do I think that should be the case for other people? No, I don't at all. I think that it's actually unethical to only provide one option. But the whole point, you know, is that it worked for me. Actually, treatment worked, sober living, all that stuff. It worked. Then it didn't work anymore, and I started to get really back to where we were talking about at the beginning, and not wanting to be around anymore in recovery after doing everything I was supposed to do. Everything, you know, I was the H&I rep for my steering committee in my home group. I was going to prisons and doing service work, you know, bringing in, you know, big books into prisons and donating them. I was like, you know, the whole, like I said, I was a little poster boy for abstinence-based recovery. And I got miserable. I was really not doing well. And I was trying so hard. I was doing everything. So that is where the deprogramming began, because it was scary, and I felt like I felt like I was back at square one, and I didn't use. I was literally, it felt, I was like, I've lost. None of this was real, is what it felt like. I was like, I did all this work, and now I don't want to be around anymore. And it was scary to where everyone in my family that was aware of that was very scared for my life. And this is, you know, 4.5 years into recovery. So that's where that journey began, and I had no clue of I did not know what to do, because I didn't know that there were really any other things except for some alternative recovery programs. For me, community, the context of recovery community was starting to become harmful for me. And that's just the blunt truth, is that I'm someone who, I'm on the spectrum as well. It was really not good for my mental health to be in those spaces, quite frankly. And that, you know, people have a lot of different opinions on that. I think that it's, you know, some excuse to try to not do it. It just was not, it was not good. And I was not respecting that it was not good. I was just forcing it. And so, yeah, that's what started it, is that I ended up, you know, I met with my sponsor every Sunday. I went to my sponsor. I basically made an excuse and said, the time isn't working for me anymore. You know, it was very early in the morning. And I was just like, yeah, I just don't think I want to do this anymore. And it's just not really working with my schedule, which honestly was not true. At that point, I still didn't know how to be direct. That was like a couple years later, I learned how to be direct. But yeah, it started with that, and it was respected. My sponsor respected. Didn't say I was going to relapse or unalive or anything. It was just like, okay, cool. But that's how it started, is I just started to separate myself from that space. And the thing is that during that time, there was none of me that was getting delusional about what my use looked like. So that's, I think, where it can be sketchy for people, is that that can be paired with this denial of your truth. That was not the case. It actually was something that I mention a lot, and sounds very dark, but when you realize for you that using is not an option, and you get to that place to where you feel completely terrible and you're like, I don't want to be around, and using's not an option, that's a dangerous place to be. So I don't encourage people to get to that place. Quite frankly, I think it's a lot better for you to use something and test it, make sure it is what it is, of course, and to be alive than to unalive, because using is not an option. I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but I know just it's a dangerous place to be. So I just had to forge my own path basically. And I'll tell you what I did is I did a bunch of affirmations, which are very woo woo. It sounds like I'm not suggesting that that's what everyone needs to do, but I realized that my internal voice was just like my enemy basically. And I was already in recovery. And then I started to realize the power of words. I started to realize that I was calling myself an addict every single day. I was using the word I am and then saying addict, which I am is one of the most powerful things you can say. When you specifically when you follow it with like a label or something like that. So I started to get real trippy and really aware of the words I was saying and the intention I was putting out and the idea that I needed to make up for my passive substance use disorder. And I started to break that down and realize that, hey, you worked the steps multiple times without relapsing. So you did all the amends, all the inventory, all that stuff. And I was like, well, hold on a second. Like there's something here that is keeping me, it made me feel stuck. And it made me feel perpetually in recovery. And for me, that's not helpful. I need to establish being recovered, and people get fired up if you hear the word recovered, but it's not from a place of ego. It's from a place of moving on and also still recovering when it comes to mental health. That's there. I'm still recovering from that. Substance use disorder, that is, I'm not recovering from that at all. That's already established, and I've been able to move on from that and still advocate and still talk about it and keep it fresh. And again, not to get delusional, but it was just an inside job of, again, affirmations, like over the top, like not listening to music, not watching TV, not consuming any content, just listening to affirmations and saying affirmations and meditating and changing my language. And it was a long road. I mean, if you look at my content from, I think, 2020, the way I talk about it is very stigmatizing. It's very, traditional.
How do you suggest for other people that struggle? You have people that are here, and then you have people like how do you find balance when you're learning to reword things?
So when you're indoctrinated into a way of speaking, it is just ingrained, and it's unintentional. Yes. It feels involuntary. So I can just say that. Okay. I don't judge anyone who's saying, addict, alcoholic, clean, sober. That's just not terminology that I use unless I'm kind of having to explain something, because it's like you can't lead with the more wordy terminology without explaining the alternative. You know what I mean? Or the traditional terminology. So it honestly, like I said, I was deprogramming and still using a lot of that stuff, and it wasn't until I started to really look more into just other people, and TikTok was a huge part about it. And I started to realize that, oh yeah, there's people who are not speaking about this in a fundamentalist 12-step way. And basically I realized that was even a thing. During the same time, again, I was just really looking into meaning of words, all that kind of, trippy stuff. And for me, it was just about being understanding towards myself, knowing that this was something that I had been taught and indoctrinated into. But then it's all practice and repetition. That's all it is. As with anything. And, that's what I always talk about, practice and repetition when I'm talking to my clients and stuff. It's like, that's it. You just do this very repetitively. You practice it. You get used to it. So that's all I can say for people is you can look into things like, go and research what person first language is. You know what I mean? Go and look for information as far as why we don't lead with stigmatizing terms. And for those of us that's part of our message and our journey. And you'll find some really good information. You can also find, real valid sources that are citing why it's very important to kind of change language around this. So
how did you learn to articulate your words so well? You're so well spoken. Like when you speak very, it's a beautiful thing to listen to, the way that you phrase things, seriously. So
I'm a lyricist, so I've always been like a songwriter. It comes from that. It comes from me valuing my dad's ability to articulate himself, which was actually taken away after he had a stroke. So there's a lot of emotions tied to my ability to speak, and that's something that I value a lot. And a lot of it is a defense mechanism. I'm going to be honest. A lot of it is like, I'm going to let people know that I can articulate myself. And it's literally a defense mechanism. It's a form of deflection. It's like, I'm going to just really be wordy and shit. So I'm not going to sit here and lie and say that that's just how it, no, there's definitely intention behind it of protecting myself. And it has to do with also feeling marginalized in substance use disorder and feeling like less than and being labeled as less than and not as valid as so-called normal people, which what is normal? I'm sorry, like what really is normal?
How did you find your voice? How did you go from like this young little boy that got into an accident like at a young age, and I'm sure you didn't have a voice then, but where did you get to the point where you're like, damn, I got a voice now?
You educated yourself enough where you could finally express yourself the way you wanted to.
Facts. Yeah, it was, as far as me just understanding some of these concepts and the idea of like, what is substance use disorder? How does it work? What's the definition of it? What is a compulsion? What does that mean? You know, why is part of this very largely involuntary? Why, you know, so it just was like inquisitive. I was just like, I'm going to keep looking into this and figuring it out, because I was offered just the information I was offered was very archaic and not up to date. I'm sorry. And that's not meant to be a jab, but it's like, that's really what it was. And I was like, I realized after years of being in a space of recovery that I didn't really understand it. And I was like, what the hell, dude? Like, I've spent years doing this, right. And it was so discouraging. But it was about, I learned how to be direct. That's the main thing. I learned how to be direct, and I stopped people pleasing. So those are the main things, is that I did not know how to be direct. I felt trapped in saying yes to things because I had to live up to now being a productive member of society and being worthy. Again, our passive substance use disorder becomes a life sentence in recovery. No, that does not need to be the case. It is okay to recover from that. It is okay. It doesn't mean you're cocky, or, you know, you can do that. You can establish that. There just needs to be continued work, in my opinion, on mental health for those who have mental health challenges, and a lot of us do. But yeah, I was learning how to be direct. That was literally the first thing. Was I had to feel comfortable in even being direct in order to fully articulate how I felt or what I was realizing or figuring out. And so it started in, you know, I'm a former chef. I do personal chef work, but it's just one of my, you know, 4 or 5 jobs. But anyways, it started there in the culinary industry. I was, you know, being a chef is extremely toxic. Even in recovery, I'm sorry, it just is. I was even working at a space that was employing people in recovery, and it was so toxic, it was ridiculous. But I was learning to be direct in that context, because you can be really blunt in that setting, and so that's where it started. I started to dip my toes in it, and then it ended up being with a GM there. And I wasn't getting paid I didn't get paid on time. And they were basically like, well, you need to figure it out. I was like, no, dude. But learning to articulate myself without getting angry, but also being like entitled to responding to things that were not okay. And so that's what a lot of it was. And I did that with another person that was there, that I was in early recovery, and I was being very supportive and very loving towards them. And they were being very nasty and just kind of rude to people, and you know, not really to me, but just was setting a tone of just really whack energy. And so there was different times I got to learn to communicate things that were uncomfortable, and that's really where it started. Is that's where I started to kind of get my voice. And I'll tell you this, and then I'll shut up for a second. I could not talk without my voice shaking or cracking or me physically shaking when I got into recovery. At all.
I had a lot of like anxiety issues, especially beforehand. I was fine. I used to be able to articulate myself really well. I could have a conversation with anybody. It wouldn't be a big deal. Something about whenever I started to recover, like it just took that confidence away. And I don't really know what changed, but I hit a point where it's like, I can't have a conversation with somebody without shaking, getting super anxiety, sweating. Like, it was every single thing. And I still experience that to an extent, but it's nothing like how it was. And I don't understand that psychological change that happens, but it's intense.
Yeah, no, a lot of it for me was post-acute withdrawal, honestly, which was persistent. So I would, you know, the last things I was using was opioids and specifically Klonopin. And Klonopin can have, you know, you can be in post-acute from Klonopin for like a year, literally. So the first year I was just like, and I was doing service work and stuff, and like literally like shaking, and even started chairing meetings, and would actively be like, you could hear the like podium like rattling, literally, like it was rough. And then people were judging. I literally had people come up to me like thinking that I was having DTs, literally. Like I had multiple people that are like, are you good? Like, are you drinking? I was just like, no, dude. Like, I just have like really bad anxiety, so a lot of it was exposure.
I have like myoclonic jerks coming off of the benzos, because I know I did, and it was very hard to hide that. Like what you said, you would just be somewhere and all of a sudden like.
Yeah, I had those like early on in the process. Those were very prevalent. And then they they really weren't as common long term. The main stuff, like I said, was just like a kind of a constant state of shaking. My hand was never stable ever, but then it would get more pronounced, especially in meetings, and because it was very overwhelming for sitting in a room with that many people and the energy of that room. And again, that kind of ties back into why, like, long term, it was not entirely helpful for me, especially as someone who started to realize that often in those spaces, you are sitting with perpetuators of the things that you've experienced in your life, if you know what I mean. So it, again, that all sounds like a jab at it. And I just want to say, like, I fully support 12-step. I have clients that I work with, and I can, if they articulate certain things, I'm like, hey, this is a great option for you. It's very accessible as well, and it's very, very common. But yeah, the main thing was just shaking. Again, I felt like I was being punished. That was the energy that I had, was like, you felt too good for too long, and now you can never feel good again. So that kind of was part of it as well. When it came to my feelings, I was in a state of kind of dysphoria for a really long time. And then I started to get a lot of relief from articulating myself, actually. So that kind of puts a bow on it, kind of ties it all together. That's why I still do it so much. That's why I talk so much, is because it's like to say that it's not like, partly selfish it would just be BS, because a lot of it is like, I found that the more I talked, the better I felt.
Where do you think you lost the ability or never gained the ability to be direct like that? Because growing up, you had your parents, and I guess you didn't have the authority figure, so that made a huge difference, but you still had people that you could treat more like peers. And I feel like sometimes that helps people be more direct. So where do you think that disconnect was?
I could be really blunt with like jokey stuff. Like it was like, like you said, it's like a peer thing, to where it's like, we would, make fun of, like, there would be someone in this group of adults, and we would like make fun of one of them, or like say, just like in good fun joking. But it was that vibe, to where it's like, oh, you're one of us, and we, a lot of adults cussing and all that stuff. So it just was like, that was it. And I also had, like I said, I did have peers too that were in that same space. So I had my best friend, one of my other best friends, who's an amazing actor. It was all this just really weird space to be in, honestly. And so you're spot on, to where there was a certain level of being direct, but it wasn't about things that mattered. It was all about just like surface level things, and like maybe even like gossip type stuff. And like, because a lot of the adults I was around were maybe not the most mature. So it was, there was that kind of rapport, but it did not relate to how I truly felt. It did not relate to what I truly needed. And so that's all what it came down to, is that I felt unworthy. Even as a kid, I had that feeling of being unworthy. But then when you add in a substance use disorder, then it's like, oh yeah, like now it's like really, unworthy.
How was it with your parents' divorce? Did that like make a turning point for you, or did you take one parent's side over the other parent's side? How did you deal with that?
I don't remember a lot of that time. I know once it was, I didn't know what happened, you know what I mean? And like I said, because my dad was, he went from being the most articulate person that I've ever met, who, that's like who I emulated. That's literally who I still am emulating, basically, even though he can't talk like that anymore. So it was not just the divorce, it was the whole, the stroke aspect is what was really the most profound, kind of like dramatic aspect, because I started blacked. There's periods that I literally blacked out, and I wasn't even like using Xans at that point. So, I know that my mom immediately was like in a relationship that was really weird to me. Like I'm talking like probably within days. And they were all just doing whatever they wanted. And I knew that, I saw that, I knew that was already the thing. They just thought I didn't know. So it was kind of like a scapegoat situation. Honestly, it really was. My mom wasn't perfect with what she was doing. And so I knew that, and I was like, what the hell? Like, y'all, I've seen what's been going on. I know what's been happening, and now it's going to be, oh, no.
Did that give you more freedom because, like, your mom was preoccupied and then your dad was sick? Did that give you more freedom to do what you wanted to do?
Yeah, I didn't want freedom at all, and I wasn't even consuming cannabis or alcohol at that point. Like I said, I waited. Like I had friends, all my friends were consuming cannabis, messing around with alcohol. I would be the one kid there not doing it. So it was because of all that trauma that I was like scared of. I was like just very scared, very, very scared kid. And just to clarify, as far as like the dynamic, because I want to actually answer your question, is I ended up basically just going back and forth, and there's a whole period of after that happened when my dad had just got an apartment, and I don't know what the hell was going on. I just remember being in this apartment and not having food and a lot of stuff like that. So I that's a whole nother part to my story, is that I'm diagnosed with disordered eating, and so that all ties into it too, to where basically there was so much focus on all these other things that like basic self-care stuff just like wasn't a thing anymore. And like, so even eating food wasn't a thing. So I felt very unsafe, very I felt like I just didn't have what I needed, and I didn't even know it, basically.
I want to get back into the like language you use and stuff like that a little bit, because and this is just me personally, I am not the best with that stuff. And it's part of the reason is because I grew up in that AA culture. Whenever I went to rehab and actually got sober, it was AA, NA. I started leading meetings, and that was kind of all I was surrounded with. But I also grew up in some rougher environments, I guess. And it, like I use the word clean.
Yeah.
I shouldn't use that word, but at the same time, I feel like most people who know me know I don't mean it in a negative way. So how much do you feel like that matters?
I don't use the words that I use really. It's not only because I feel some type of way about it.
Sure.
I do now, knowing about it. And honestly, it all has to do with the person saying it too. I'm not going to lie. So you saying any of those words it's not going to bother me. Marie saying any of those words is not going to bother me. Do I think that it's not the most effective? Yeah, I do. Objectively, I do. But there's also context here. So, honestly, when it comes to, I just want to touch on what you said. In a lot of cultures, I'm not going to go in and be like, you just said addict. Well, have you ever heard of the term substance use disorder? It's like, it's just tone deaf and it's just weird. It gives off a weird vibe. I do want it to be more widely known on a cultural level, and that's part of why I do what I do. But, I can say, dude, I mean, how it was very hard to get at. Like, I now have to try to say addict. I have to try to say alcoholic. I have to try to say clean. I have to try to say sober. I have to go out of my way to say it. It's the same way when it's flipped. That's all I can say. Like 100%. That's what it is. And again, it's just you through practice and repetition, it becomes normal, and it just becomes, that's just how I speak. Now I have I have friends that are about, a decade in like I am, and are at the same, or at a place to where they're still trying to transition out of that. And, and all of it also has to do with, I think this is something that's very important when when you're talking to people who are actively using. That is where I'm really, really serious about it, because it's just, I think there's a way to do this though. You can figure out what people resonate with by communicating with them. And it's totally fine if someone is resonating with addict to use the term addict, but I think you need to also inform them that there's an alternative. So even if they're cool with it, so that, that's my whole thing, is like just being very considerate and informing people, hey, there's other options too.
You have to meet people where they're at, basically. So,
Yeah.
everybody's in a different mental head space. Everybody wants different, we all want the same outcome. We just take different pathways to get there.
Facts.
So now that you are kind of in this position where you've deprogrammed and you're helping others do the same, and you're kind of being more conscious of your language, what are some of the biggest struggles you are having with trying to help guide people into the same viewpoint? Because I see a lot of you get just a lot of unnecessary hate, and it's stupid. It's so stupid, but I don't know how you handle it sometimes.
When you come from such a space of turmoil and kind of erratic, family and culture and everything, it's my trauma now I've been so exposed to stuff that I have a huge tolerance at some level, and then if I'm not in a good headspace, then I have zero tolerance. So it just depends, but I actually maintain at a level to where, and I keep going off and just totally going off into left field every question y'all are asking me. I'm sorry, but it's as I said, I am on the spectrum, so please understand that's where my communication kind of can be a little bit off. But yeah, so basically, when things get hard, I don't go to the whole everything sucks, this is all disaster. I can still go there, but it just isn't common anymore. And so as it relates to people that are, downright, they're triggered by the idea of being compassionate. That's what it is. So I understand that. At the same time, again, it depends on what day you catch me. Cause it's obviously lives are performative. The ones that I do are educational, but I also will intentionally get fired up and be like, oh, and because I know that it's supposed to be kind of performative. So yeah, it just depends. But honestly, I just use it as a moment to articulate the whole point. So it all is really helpful because we have people coming in that are extremely stigmatizing, and then it's they'll say the perfect things that I can address. And so that's basically what it is I see it as they're giving me something of value, because I'm oh, you have an extremely stigmatized way of looking at this. All right, word. And you're saying specific things that I have a lot of insight on those things because I've been obsessive with it. And so yeah, that's the only way that I transmute it. I take it in and I'm how can I turn this into something positive, basically? And so that's how I deal with it. But catch me on a day that I'm feeling salty and I'm about to be salty as hell, and I'm gonna so that's why I don't make video responses the same day. If I see some wild misinformation, I usually wait a day. Right. So you get to see the live version of that. You know what I mean? But yeah, it's just I understand that people are ultimately programmed, in that they were programmed because they were struggling and they found something that worked for them. And I'll just say this real briefly. I really just advocate for people who are using. That's my main cause. That's what my content is for. People who are using. Those are the people that I want to reach. That's who I want in my lives. I want people actively high. I want people actively drunk. I want I welcome that. But I also do have a sense of defensiveness, not just for people who are using, but for people who are in recovery that have been scapegoated and stigmatized and only given one option and feel trapped, feel like they have a life sentence of recovery and that they will always have to be living up to this. They will always be in this eternal battle. And so a lot of it has to do with that. So again, as it relates to people coming in that are in that space, I'm going to have a certain level of compassion towards that, because I'm dude, you've been indoctrinated into this way of thinking, and you're also name calling and stuff, so you're not doing well. So you're not doing, people don't go around name calling if they're doing well mentally. So it gives me kind of an insight into, and not everyone's in that space, you know what I mean? There's some people that, they've just found what works for them and they're sharing that. But that also ties into I really want to go into this, but the lived experience fallacy. But hopefully I actually answered your question that time.
So getting into that, the whole lived experience, situation is, and I understand it because whenever I first started, I started my account coming off of subs, and I looked at subs as another thing that I was using, even though I wasn't abusing them or anything. It was still something that was keeping me from being completely sober, and that's just how I looked at it because I felt tricked onto them. And while I was getting off subs, it was very much lived experience because everything I was doing was recording my withdrawal and everything.
Yeah.
And then I told my story. And I think that was helpful for a lot of people. But at the same time, I have learned now I could have done things differently just because I did do a lot of, I've had experience in leading meetings. I've helped a lot of people getting sober, but I did a lot of, me talk instead of we talk, I guess. And I had to learn how to fix that and be more effective in teaching people. So yeah, I'm curious what your positions are. Like, what do you think is right for people to talk about whenever it comes to lived experience?
It's right to talk about. You can talk about whatever you want with lived experience. It's just when it's presented as dangerous medical advice is when I have an issue with it. A lot of unqualified people in recovery give advice, point blank. And you know, it can be framed as a suggestion within 12-step, but it's advice. You're giving advice. It's just you saying it's, you know, I hate to parrot things from 12-step, but it's like the whole like, yeah, it's like we suggest that you use a parachute if you jump out of an airplane. It's like you kind of have to do it. But look, I did the same thing, bro. That's literally what I started doing. I was on methadone. It didn't work for me, and so I felt I had to save other people from methadone. And it was like I was entitled to do it too. I was like, gotta let people know what it really is and all this other stuff. And it's like, I was extremely impulsive and I was not using the medication the way that it's supposed to be used. And that's why it didn't really work for me.
Did you ever try another form of medicated assisted treatment besides methadone?
No, they put me on subs for like literally where they were offering them to me in treatment for a span. I had access to them for maybe about, honestly, like maybe 2 weeks at the most. You know, sometimes they'll do like a 3-week kind of implementation of them, which is so short term. I was demonizing all meds and also still begrudgingly taking them. So I didn't take all the subs they were offering me. I was literally just like, but then I would, and it wouldn't get me high at all because I was coming off methadone. So it was like, it made me feel a little bit better, but I was like, you know what? I basically would avoid meds to the point that I started like actively getting worse. But no, I did not. I was in, you know, there's other forms of medication assisted treatment that are not partial agonists or agonists. There's, you know, that's what so many meds are. You know, of course, when we say MAT, we're talking usually about those replacements, but there's things, you know, there's obviously other alternatives. Not all are created equal, but I was heavily medicated basically on antipsychotics, on I was taking Wellbutrin, I was taking Seroquel, I was taking Seroquel XR during the day, I was taking Depakote, I was taking gabapentin and clonidine, and I think that was it at that point. So they threw the pharmacy at me because they deemed me as having behavioral issues. Because I was emotional. So they basically were like, this is annoying. You keep coming to the nurse station telling me that you don't feel good. So let's just throw stuff at you, basically. So that's what a lot of it was for me is I felt, again, like I had no control over where my life was going. And it wasn't in a good way. It was like, you're someone, I hate authority still to this day. I really hated it even more when I was using. And then in early recovery, you know, while I was using, my whole thing was avoiding authority and you know, being just in my own world. And then now all of a sudden I'm like having intervention, you know, going into treatment, and it's like you now have no say in what the hell your life is, bro. You're going to take 10 meds and you got to do all this stuff. You got to wake up at 6 a.m., you know, all this stuff. And I was just like, damn. Y'all played me. The universe, like I felt played by the universe. I was like, and now they're telling me I need to get a job and shit, because I was just living with my mom for the last 2 years. So I was like, oh, this is literally a way of you tricking me into doing all the things I don't want to do. But yeah, the meds, just real briefly, I'll say, basically, this all ties into what Kyle was saying. Not only was I was hating on methadone specifically, but I also, and I'm not saying that's what you were doing, Kyle, but I also was like invalidating so-called big pharma as a whole, and I just think that's really not the vibe, dude. Like I think big pharma is very important actually, and I think plant medicines are better in my opinion. That's just based on my opinion, but yeah, I fell into all the a lot of people they turn into like these like kind of it's almost like a pastor, or like it's this, you're like preaching, and literally preaching is the perfect word, but it's like it's coming from a place of the intention is to help others, and it's just it gets misguided due to lived experience. So that's where it gets tricky. And so I again, just to kind of circle back, it all comes down to just being mindful and giving lived experience when it is actually like warranted, and when it is kind of asked for too. I think a lot of people in recovery do the whole, well, my experience is this, and it's like, bro, no one asked you. Don't just. And I'm sorry, it sounds overcritical, but I was that guy. I was like, anything that I can then go, well, my lived experience. It was just like, bro, it's a little bit tone deaf. So there's nothing wrong with sharing lived experience. I only do it like in this context. I'll share it, and if I'm working with someone one-on-one and they're sharing something with me and they're asking me questions, I'll do that. But if I'm giving like advice, none of it's going to be based on lived experience. Actually, it's going to all be based on where that person is at, what I know about them, and then what options could work for them, and I'll give them all to them based on like giving them the education that they deserve on that, and then letting them pick what they want to do. So that's I think that's the missing link when it comes to lived experience as far as giving advice based on it. You know what I mean? There's a way to do it tactfully, and there's a way to do it to where, again, the intention is great, but it's like you end up projecting onto people, basically.
That was kind of my thing. I hit that point where I was angry at subs. I was angry at everything, really. But I hit that point where I just educated people on, no matter what it was, whether it was MAT or an anxiety med that they wanted to take. Here are the normal things that may happen. Here are the normal things that could be side effects, whatever. And make sure that they can make an informed decision based on facts that I know from what some other people have gone through. Sometimes it's like what they post on the CDC website or FDA, whatever. But having the facts and everything in place are very important whenever it comes to the detox centers too. And I feel like the detox centers skew those facts, because like for subs, they told my wife that basically subs were perfect. They were going to save my life. And if I did not take them, I was screwed. I was never going to. So it got to a point where she said, you have to take these. And my parents said, you have to take these or you don't get your kids anymore. And that was what made me demonize them. So,
I feel like you held a resentment. That's a resentment. That's what I would see it as.
Yep.
Well, I mean, and I'll say this because on the top, really briefly, resentments are totally okay. You know what I mean? And the idea of resentment is so demonized. It's like, yeah, it's good to address those things for sure. I also think a lot of times it ends up demonizing anger, and it's like when you demonize anger as depending on how you identify, and not just men, women, or non-binary people. It doesn't matter how you identify. If you do that, a lot of times it makes it worse, and then it's like, and again, I'm not going to go off on a tangent here, but I appreciate you saying the keyword resentment, because yes, 100% what ends up happening is there's this aspect of feeling taken advantage of it at sometimes, feeling like you weren't given all the right information, and that breeds a resentment, which I think is completely valid. And of course, for your own sake, it's good to look at it, but the ways of addressing that I don't think are always necessarily doing any sort of inventory. I think that a lot of times those things have to be worked through with like a clinician, or just I can just say that for myself, that that was a part of it, was starting to learn how to do that. You know what I mean? 100%. And then there was certain things that just writing couldn't touch, really. You know what I mean? And I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but I appreciate you bringing that up, Marie. I'll say that what you have a problem with is lack of informed consent.
Yep.
That's what it is. And that's I have a huge problem with lack of not doctors and providers not giving informed consent. And then also it's coercion. You are literally, that's what a lot of treatment is. It's emotional manipulation and coercion. That's point blank what it is. And people feel entitled to do that because especially if their child or their whoever might unalive, then it's like, oh yeah, we'll do whatever it takes. You know what I mean? That to me is unethical. Honestly, I think that there's ways to communicate and there's ways to provide resources that are not rooted in coercion or anything like that. But yeah, that's something that I advocate for all the time, is informed consent, because it is lacking with certain even addiction medicine doctors, literally, to where they are trying to coerce someone into taking Matt out of this way of scaring them. They're scaring them and telling them that they're going to unalive, basically, if they don't do it. Now, the stats for Matt are great. They're really good stats. But we can acknowledge both things. We could say, hey, yeah, this is like a really good treatment option for a lot of people. And we can also acknowledge that people deserve basic human decency and respect when they're in a position where they're vulnerable and they're looking for resources. And to not give them full informed consent is not okay. So I think what ends up happening is that people, they get mad at the medication a lot of times, and then then maybe later on there's more awareness as it relates to the provider. You know what I mean? And then it can all be about everything, and you start to get clarity on the whole situation. But that's the thing. I mean, I had an addiction medicine doctor throughout the first, I don't think it was the first few years. And, I was not on subs, but I saw the way that this doctor was talking about it. And it was very manipulative, and it just was. I'm sorry. So not all providers are created equal. So that's just the truth. And we need informed consent, basically.
And also, I noticed sometimes with the medicated assisted treatment, like I was on Suboxone for years, and I wanted to get on Sublocade, but my doctor kept putting me off for years because, hey.
Yeah, it's like, this all comes down to the way that we advocate for individuals with substance use disorder. It robs people of autonomy. And it's also paired with this idea that you will never, ever be able to make a sound decision in your life ever again, especially medical decisions. And people may say, oh, that sounds maybe extreme. No, like, it's basically you need to talk to other people, and that's the only way that you can make a sound decision. I do not believe that. I think that in early recovery, yes, 100%, that can be a thing. Long-term recovery, you get into it deep. Bro, you can learn to make sound decisions. It's not like, again, it all ties back to this life sentence of recovery. And I don't, it's not meant to be anyone in here who like really identifies with being in recovery. My intention is not to invalidate that. That's totally valid. I just, again, started to realize, hey, this is set up in a way to where I'm going to be disenfranchised basically for the rest of my life. And I don't want that. I want to be able to make sound decisions. I want to be able to make medical decisions. I want to be able to do all of that. And I'm not saying you can't claim that while also identifying as being in recovery, but a lot of it ties into, what space you're in. And again, the way that we lead is not ethical. Interventions, like attack interventions, or the ones where they spring them on someone, those are unethical in my opinion. There's interventionists now that are very ethics-based and trauma-informed and that are like, really qualified, that do not do that. They go about it in an ethical way. It's a communication that is not sprung on someone. They also don't use emotional manipulation tactics and coercion. Treatment, it's filled with that. It's, just the way that we address this, in my opinion, is really outdated at this point, and it's going to change. It's actively changing, and we're going to see in the next 5, 10, 15 years that it will be a totally different space, and that's good, but currently it's not there yet, and that's why I have a lot of conviction in talking about these things, because it's like you deserve to have a voice in your life. You have not lost a say. You have not lost your say when it comes to what your life can look like and all that stuff. And I don't know. I just felt like I had to put my head down and just make it through the day every day for the rest of my. And it's just like, no, dude. You can really create something that you are excited about. And even when we talk about people who are, saying, oh, it's so boring being in recovery and all this other stuff, it's like, I understand that. But at the same time, we actually have the opportunity to create literally a different reality for ourselves. And it sounds very new agey and weird, but a lot of that for me was not possible while I was upholding limiting beliefs.
I did want to do a little bit of kind of back and forth. And if there are things you cannot talk about or answer because you may need more information, that's fine. That's a big deal. I just wanted to get your side of things on some of the bigger topics. So first off, people talking about MAP programs and how subs and methadone and all that stuff's not sober. Well,
I think the word sober, I go by the definition of the word sober, and that's to be unaffected by alcohol. If you, technically speaking, that if you want to go down to the meaning of that word, of course you can find other definitions of that word, like more in-depth definitions, but technically speaking, that's what that means. And so if you are unaffected by alcohol, you can label yourself as sober all you want. I just don't. I'll tell you I promise I won't go off too far with this, but the term sober is associated with a boring, shitty experience for people who are actively using. And for us, for those of us who've like reclaimed that, it's different, of course. But for people who are actively using, it sounds terrible, and it's rooted in the word sober itself. So I would offer this perspective. You can call yourself sober all you want. Do you really, is that serving you? Is it helping you really? If it is, then keep doing it. But that's my thing, is like, a lot of this is like, do you want to be part of the club that's maybe not accepting you? Because I don't. So that's what a lot of it is that but you deserve acceptance at the same time. You know what I mean? So my way of thinking with this is like, what you want, you're using a self-identifying term so that you are accepted, but I don't want to be in the same space as judgmental, bigoted people. So that's all I'll say about that.
I'm trying to think of everything from the other side, so this is hard. Because the other thing is, you are still using a substance that alters your perception. It still serves the purposes of creating dopamine and serotonin and all that stuff for you.
Yeah.
So how can you say that is sober?
No, 100%. Well, again, I'm going to bring it to this. So that's based in that idea is based in the abstinence model. That's where that comes from. My question for people is, again, do you want to be associated with that space? Do you want to be, it's the same thing. It's like, yeah, we can acknowledge that, things can give you releases in your brain and stuff, but we have to hold everyone to that same standard if we're working within those parameters. So, and you've heard it, I'm sure all of y'all have heard it before, but it's like, you cannot lead with that no mind mood altering BS if you are consuming nicotine, if you're consuming caffeine, it's not accountable. So if you want to play that card, you then have to be completely abstinent in order for that to be authentic and not just BS that you're parroting. So the same thing applies to, guess what? You're not going to be without, you're going to get stimuli from outside things. I'm a huge proponent of cold plunges. Dude, after you do a cold plunge, guess what you get? You're going to get those hits. You're going to feel a stimulant feeling. Hot baths, saunas, feels like an opiate or opioid. You know what I mean? So, you're never going to be able to stop yourself from getting some sort of outside stimuli, and you shouldn't. And I think that, again, what this does is it demonizes also feeling good, which is totally okay to feel good, even if it's from eating something or an activity or adult activity, whatever it may be. So yeah, again, it's just if people want to lead with that, they need to be accountable about it, because those very same people are usually, facing vapes and cigs and drinking tons of energy drinks. And for those that aren't, You could say that. I guess that could be authentic for them to lead with that. Is it helpful? No, but yeah, I mean, when it comes to like efficacy and when it comes to, like actually getting high though, that's where I will be really clear on like, with like subs for people who are, who have an opioid use disorder and a dependency, which is, often associated. I can just say from my experience, like, when they gave me subs for that small amount of time, like I said, there was not even a single aspect of me getting high from that shit. I was like, it was so like not that even noticeable. Like I said, that I didn't even continue taking them the whole time. So, yeah, it's just, again, I ask that people, or I offer this to people, ask yourself this question. Do you want to share space with people who are judgmental? Do you want to share space with people who are not informed? Do you want to share space with people who are just kind of looking for things to invalidate? And I would say most people wouldn't. But it's okay to seek that validation. I understand why people would do that. And I just would discourage it.
See, I say the same thing too whenever people come at me with that. And I've never had someone actually come back and respond after I come at them with that thing. So I still can't think of something to come at you with from that side. There's no reason to. It's that person is not happy with something in their lives, and figuring that out and trying to help them in that way is probably the best idea.
Facts. I mean, look, I'll say this really quick because it brought up something really good for me. So this happens. It's a perpetuation of abuse is what this is. And people are put in a position to where they're treated unethically within traditional spaces usually, and within detox and treatment. They are not given meds sometimes. It's not always people who are biased because they had a bad experience. It's also people who were not given comfort meds, who were treated with this fundamentalist anti-medication type stuff. Those people then are like, oh, you're going to actually have meds that help you? Nah, I didn't have that. So a lot of it is like this childish, like, kind of like, you got to have candy, and I don't. It's, you know what I mean? That's a dumb comparison to compare it to candy, but a lot of it is that, and it's rooted in, again, like this pull yourself up by your bootstraps, rigid mentality that you'll find. And yeah, it's the same thing with people who, have faced some sort of abuse in their life and then end up perpetuating that same abuse, which doesn't always happen, but it does a lot.
How do you break the cycle successfully? Do you feel like therapy is the answer? Do you feel like cutting people off?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what cycle you're in, because some of those things are going to be totally pathological and clinical. And so I can't, and I'm not qualified to speak on that, but I can just say that, you have to first realize it, obviously, and have some insight about that. And that's what the case was. That's what it looked like for me, is because, like I said, my attempts at advocacy were problematic at best. And so I had to actually, I had to humble myself too, and kind of like drop my ego, and like, which is interesting because a lot of people, their reaction to me now is like, damn, this dude is cocky as shit and arrogant and all this stuff. And it's like, I understand that perception. But that was what a lot of it was, is like insight, being aware of something, and then kind of dropping your guard a little bit and being open to different things. And what that may look like is basic kind of self-education you can look into. I encourage people to look into like actual like Google Scholar instead of just Googling things. Go to Google Scholar, look at peer-reviewed studies, look at evidence-based studies, look at, all this type of stuff. So there's ways you can do that. It's all in context. If you're someone who's doing some type of harmful, compulsive behavior, and you're doing that towards other people, like physically or other things, then I can't say it. That has to be completely addressed, like from a clinical perspective. You know what I mean? But we can totally do a lot of things that are not as intense. Like if we're addressing something that may be compulsive or just a way of operating or communicating that has been deemed ineffective, then we actually do have a lot of resources that are free and that just involve, again, like looking at real valid just sources for information. And look, you can reach out to, like, I've talked to so many doctors, I've talked to so many clinicians, I've had clinicians as clients for my recovery coaching. So I've had the opportunity to speak to people who are way smarter than me. I say that all the time, but that's what it is like a lot of it is that too. It's that if you humble yourself just enough to be wrong, then you can get on the right side of it, basically.
So the next one, and bear with me here because I'm going to say some stupid things. For the good ones. So weed that is laced with finch. If I smoke it, I am going to OD.
I thought this was true when I heard this years ago. So I want to be clear. Like, again, a lot of this stuff is me just dropping my kind of arrogance when it came to me thinking I understood everything because of my one approach that I had. So that's where this starts, is I heard about this, and because I didn't understand that you can't even smoke it, and you have to vape it, I was like, yeah, this is totally a thing. Now, did I think that it was like intentional? People were putting it in there to try to unalive people? No, I never thought that. I was like, bruh, like if you know, you know. People aren't. I'm sorry, like I just do not see that ever. People who consume canna, it's like a very like connoisseur type of community. You know what I mean? Like it's all about like, you know, the name of it and how fire it is and all this other stuff. And it's like people are not gonna be like, yeah, let me mess this up to where people unalive from doing it. So basically I started doing research, and I was like, and this was before I really heard anyone talking about it. I started to look into it, and I started to discover that there's really simple science that you can look into, and it explains that you can't even smoke it at all. So that's really the only rebuttal that you need to have to that, is that you can't smoke it. People are vaping it off foil. That is not smoking, that's vaping. So, you know, it's a very little Goldilocks perfect temp it needs to be at. It's like 871 degrees. And yeah, a lighter's way hotter than that, drastically, and a cart doesn't get that hot. So that's really what it comes down to. Now, I will be honest, there's people now that are saying, well, in a bowl, the ember could somehow vaporize what's around it. According to what I've seen with the temperatures of embers, that is still not possible. Embers are too hot. So, you know, again, I just, like I said, I heard that and I was like, oh, that kind of makes sense to me. So then I just looked into the science of how hot an ember was, and I was like, this doesn't really make sense, actually. I think if there's you have to ingest it. You have to ingest it. You can't smoke it. So, you know, you can vape it, but you need to ingest it. So technically speaking, if there was a shit ton of it on something and you touched it and then put your hands in your mouth, and I mean a lot, there need to be a significant amount, then yeah, that could potentially happen. But it looks like most cases to where this is, like there's confirmed cases of it being in there, which there are 0 confirmed cases of someone actually unaliving due to that. But there are claims of confirmed cases of it being in there. A lot of those have not been substantiated, you know, that I will say that, but technically, if you wanted to just say, let's play devil's advocate and say, yeah, it's in there, I 100% would say that's due to, if it would be cross-contamination, and it would be very small amounts, you know. So yeah, it's something that, again, I was like, yeah, this must be real, and then I kind of just educated myself on it.
I wanted to do at least one more thing, because I know you feel like very strongly about it, at least, that medical marijuana could be a strong form of helper, like in detox facilities and stuff like that. I want to make sure I word this right.
Yeah.
What do you think are the pros and cons to that? Because in my mind, it's some of the cons would be, I know if I would smoke it, I would end up to the point where I would have I'd be less able to control myself.
Your inhibitions would be lowered.
Yeah. But at the same time, it helps with that pain and stuff, which I think is why it's great for chronic pain patients who can't get their meds anymore. But there's so much give and take to it. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
I've believed this since, even when I was fundamentalist, I believed this. I know people personally who used cannabis throughout their whole recovery, and people who used it in 12-step recovery and actively, you know, had sponsors and worked the steps and all that. So I come from a very eclectic community. So I got to see that and realize that was valid for people very early on. And just to tell y'all, this part of my journey was I got off all those medications that I shared about with CBD. And so this isn't medical advice. I don't encourage people to do that, but that's what I did. And I was using like real 1-to-1 CBD, not like that industrial hemp isolate. It was like real. It had the other active ingredient was in the CBD. And I utilized that for a couple years and then just discontinued that around the same time I quit nicotine and caffeine.
Have you ever used RSO for pain?
Yeah, I used RSO one time, and it gave me a terrible headache the next day because I took too much of it. But the thing is that in my experience, the things I was consuming throughout the process of getting off those medications, none of them created a compulsion. None of them inflamed any urge to do anything else. And that's a very biased, subjective experience, and I can acknowledge that. But just to go into the application and the pros and cons within detox, or just, we can just say recovery as a whole, but really I like the detox aspect. So I've always been for that because I had heard anecdotal things to where people who had been in and out of detox and never made it through ended up taking something in, smuggling something in like a cart, and then they made it through detox. And,
Wow.
They of course ran out at some point, and then they discontinued after that. So my thing is that so many people leave AMA that I am of the persuasion that do anything to keep them there.
Meet them where they're at.
Anything. I mean, I'm talking literally, they could be someone who is on benzos and you give them an Ativan shot. There's someone who, I'm very radicalized with this. Okay.
That's almost like exposure therapy, almost like where you're making the people, like whatever their thing is you're putting them right there in that situation.
Yeah, well, the times have changed, and so now an AMA means they're probably not going to survive. So
Absolutely.
I'm like, hey, we're in a controlled situation. Give them the damn shot of Ativan.
Yeah.
Give them the small milligram perk. Give them and I'm not saying then get them on them, or give them a long prescription for them unnecessarily. I also would advocate for that if that ends up being less problematic. But let's just go into the cannabis thing. So I do non-medical caretaking, and I do it with my friend Justin, who's NAD plus detox on TikTok. And so what they do is something called NAD plus, which is a vitamin, and then ketamine infusions. All right. But it all goes back to the point. I'm not going to rant about that. In this detox, it's outpatient. Okay. They're in an Airbnb. I'm staying in an Airbnb with the patient. And I'm just, I'm a personal chef, so they're getting fire food and, all that other stuff. But they also are treated as adults. So if they are like, I want to consume canna, they can consume canna. And that, again, it gives someone some relief. And if they're really getting kind of squirrely and they're like, oh, I gotta go do my thing, that can 100% prevent it. It can and what I've seen with those clients is, guess what? They stop. They're not requesting it. After a couple of days, they're not even requesting it, because when you're doing, like, ketamine is going to be the gold standard for detox. Mark my words, 100%. They have a psychedelic experience while they're going through this clinical detox, and it makes them not want to get high anymore. So you're then giving them freedom and saying, hey, you want to consume, they could consume an edible, they can consume flower, whatever they want. And they stop. They're not like, oh, more. It's because their symptoms are actually being addressed with the NAD plus. And so, see what I'm saying? So it's a big picture. It's not just load them up with edibles. I still would say that's better than a lot of the the more traditional things. It's more so when you address, first of all, the detox. That's what NAD does. It enhances you on a cellular level, and you go through detox at a much faster rate, but it's not like some BS accelerated, like naloxone infusion rapid detox, which is so hard on the body. Yeah. This is the opposite. It's very holistic and like wholesome in a way. It's really weird, but I got to see it, y'all. Like, I saw people coming off Fent, and on day 3, I'm making them a steak and mashed potatoes, and like they're eating. That's amazing. So it made me cry the first time that I was like, hey, dude, like this person's struggling, like what's on, what can we do for them? And the doctor is okay that this is an illegal state. We're not doing, this isn't some fringe illegal shit.
Is that in Colorado? I was watching some of the videos. Where exactly is
That's
it?
in Vegas. It's in Vegas. So, just people are treated like adults, and it's cool to be part of it because I had trauma from treatment. Honestly, I was like literally traumatized throughout treatment, if I'm being honest. And so it's healing for me to see someone that's treated like an adult. It's really nice to see someone who's given compassion and that is not, basically, just treated like they're in prison or like
With
they're
the
a child.
respect and dignity that they deserve as a human being.
Exactly. And so, the downsides to it can be that someone just gets so baked that they're like sleepy, basically. That's honestly it. Like I said, without the other things that are being applied, that's where you're going to see more of the compulsive reaching for it and all of that. So that can be addressed again if someone's actually kind of dissolving their trauma with the ket, because that's what it does. Like I haven't done it personally, but I got to see the people and I was driving them to and from, and it is like dissolving it's just dissolving it. It's really weird, and I didn't think that could happen without like a clinician like talking to someone. You know what I mean? It's somehow doing it.
Wow. So I have one more question. What are your thoughts on Ibogaine? Because I know it's very controversial. I just wanted to hear what your thoughts are.
Back to Justin again, NAD plus detox. He's the OG when it comes to all this stuff. All right, that's my OG. That's who I go to ask about all these different things that I didn't know about, because he has real experience in the field for a decade, and he was the creator of the first Ibogaine aftercare or treatment center. It was a treatment center and an aftercare in the United States. He was the first creator of that, and he doesn't suggest Ibogaine anymore. And he's someone again who's very informed on it and does not suggest it at all. So I kind of lead with someone like that who is actually a provider in that space. He doesn't invalidate it, but basically, and I guess I'm just referencing one person, but there's good data to support that it's effective for people, but it's also one of those things where there's no informed consent. It is not an easy withdrawal process. The withdrawal process can be drawn out very long, actually. It is not this magic bullet to where you do it and all of a sudden you don't experience withdrawal symptoms. It can it makes people very vulnerable. So, there were scenarios. So he's told me people are getting kidnapped in Mexico, and the people are, and that's not demonizing people in Mexico or whatever. I spent a lot of time in Mexico, and I think a lot of that is just like xenophobic BS. But you're in an unregulated territory, basically, and there's a lot of room for error and really bad practices as far as ethics and stuff. So you can unalive and just, I don't even know what will end up happening to you if your family will ever recover your body and stuff like that. So
that's very scary.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to invalidate it. It's just I respect someone who is actually in the field and like really like a real professional in the field that anyone who has questions about Ibogaine, go and talk to him. So Ibogaine is, though, it was the catalyst for his treatment recovery, though. So that's the thing, is like it's new agey, and so it's been appropriated by it's of African descent. If you want to get down to like what iboga is, it's of African descent, and it's just one of many plant medicines that's been kind of appropriated by the new age culture and has been monetized in a way that's unethical, quite frankly. It is an amazing plant medicine based on my understanding, but there needs to be aftercare. That's the key, is that it's sold as this, you go do Ibogaine and you're cured, and it's like, no, you're actually really sensitive now, and you go back to the same shit, and you're going to be very, very, very raw. And it's like turns you into like you're like a baby again, almost, as far as like your emotions and stuff. So that was before ket was widely used, and now Justin is literally like, ket is better, was his opinion on it. So it's safer. It's you're in a doctor's care, like with that clinic. It's an anesthesiologist that's administering it. So, and
I see Dr. Ems is here in the comments. She was just talking in the comments, and she's an anesthesiologist. What are your thoughts as well on kratom?
Kratom. So I used to hate on Kratom because I just thought, because I was vaping and I kept going into vape stores, and every time I saw someone that looked like they were really going through it, they were always buying Kratom. So I was like judging that based on appearance. Apparently, and this is just a side note, apparently it's supposed to be pronounced Kratom. This is from what someone told me, which I thought was really funny, but that's just a little side note. I think that, as with anything, it can be beneficial for people, and I think that it's just really when compulsive use comes into play that I find that it gets really rough for people when it comes to like their stomachs or like their gastrointestinal system, because they're consuming very massive amounts. I know people who have got upwards to like over an ounce a day. And so you're just always putting this plant matter into your stomach, which I think can often cause like just upset stomach and stuff like that. I'm not sure the science behind that, but yeah, basically I just, all I have is more anecdotal stuff. I had friends that were like, bro, this is literally like diet Norcos. Like that's literally what they compared it to. That's what they said it felt like. And they said that it messed them up more than when they were compulsively using Norcos, which I'm like, how is that even the case, bro? Because all that Tylenol will unalive you unless you know how to do the cold extraction method. So yeah, honestly, it's as with anything, I think plant medicines are amazing, so I'm going to support people who are using it. And I think we just need to have space for people to feel comfortable in saying that it's not working if it's not working. That's really all I can say. But I think it needs a little bit more oversight. I think that the quality control isn't there. I think there's a lot of byproducts in it. And I think that I've had people DM me from other countries on my TikToks, like, do you want a key? Like asking if I wanted a key of it. So, you know what I mean? Like they see me talking about this, like, substances. And so I've had literally many unsolicited offers for that. But yeah, I can't say that it's invalid. I can't say that it will, just with anything. I'm not going to say it's going to work for everyone, but I know people who it works really well for, and generally speaking, they don't consume massive amounts of it. And I appreciate talking to y'all. It's something that, like I said, I'm very hesitant to share in the context of like life story. You know what I mean? But I appreciate, y'all's questions and everything, because it was genuinely a fun time. So yeah,
this was good. And I appreciate you coming on, right, Kyle? Like, this was amazing to have this talk.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thank you for everyone that was in here. Do not forget to follow all of us. If you are not following, what are you doing?